Second International Food for Peace Conference. My name is Gerry Rose. I'm on the International Executive Committee of the National Caucus of Labor Committees, that famous organization, philosophical organization, which is frightening our enemies. And I'm also one of the founders of the Food for Peace movement. We have today with us an extraordinary gathering representing 7 nations as far away as New Zealand and Australia, West Germany, Lesotho, several other nations which you will be hearing from today, which is actually the power of the International Food for Peace movement. As you will hear through the course of the panels, one of the critical tactics that the world grain cartels are attempting to impose is to get American farmers to dump their food at below parity prices and have a trade war, which Clayton Yoder, who is our so-called trade representative at the GATT negotiations, indicated. We'll go through that a little later. So the fact that this is an international movement has given our enemies some cause to think, and you will hear about this. I just want to go through a little history of the Food for Peace movement so that you know something about it, those of you who are here for the first time. In August of this year, at the National Democratic Party convention, a platform was written by the economist Lyndon LaRouches. In this platform, it indicated the kind of crisis that the world was facing. And it critically focused on the issue of food, because at the time we were going through the worst drought in history, particularly in America, and roughly 50% of all food that is exported comes from American granaries. With the drastic collapse of stocks of food, what Lynn indicated is that the actual result of this would be that the Soviets also were involved in a massive collapse of their own food production. And we had an indication in China, in other places around the world, a massive drought was going on, and in other places of the world, a massive flood was going on. With the drop and collapse of the food stocks, this would indicate a drastic shortage of food, a massive shortage of food. Now, under conditions where the Soviets were looting Eastern Europe at an unprecedented rate for their own military buildup, given simultaneously that their own food production, because of this looting, was being destroyed by such looting, the Soviets would have a massive grain shortage, coupled with a massive grain shortage occurring in the developing sector, and a drought within the United States. In other words, this food situation had reached such a critical moment that under those conditions, the Soviets, who were attempting to gain military superiority, would, under certain conditions where they did not have food and no prospects of getting food, would be encouraged to launch a military expedition into Western Europe to take food. So under those conditions, the question of food production became a national security issue and no longer an issue of feeding people. That's obviously fundamental, but it became a national security issue. And it remains a national security issue. And the fact that the USDA has sent letters, or the FMHA, has sent letters to 50,000 to 80,000 farmers in the United States to tell them that they are going to be thrown off their land, and these are 60-page documents which we'll have somebody reporting on, which nobody can understand. It is a national security issue that we will not lose 50,000 farmers this year. It is a national security question. The issue of food is now a national security issue, because the issue is very directly, will the Soviets come in and steal the food, which they have a proclivity to do? Or will we have both the military and industrial might to both make it unnecessary and impossible for the Soviets to do? And that's why we call it Food for Peace. It is not a utopian fantasy that Harry Truman had of a one-world, you know, lovey-dovey food for peace thing. This is literally a fighting issue. And the reason that we are here today is that we are the people who are going to tell the world about this, and we're going to stop, and this is what I think the big worry is. We intend to stop what is about to occur. We intend to resist what they intend to do. And I think they know that about us. So I would like to now introduce Reverend Wade Watts, who is the Executive Director of the NAACP in Oklahoma, to introduce our next speaker.
To Mr. LaRouche and my Heavenly Father children, I'm happy to be here to make this introduction. I've got a nephew that quarterbacked the Oklahoma University football team back in the late 70s. And he was telling me about a little fella that weighed about 135 pounds, and he was going with a girl, and one of them big football tackles carried her out one night, and he'd weigh about 290, stand about 6'6". And this little fella, he said, yeah, he said, he carried my girl out, and he said, you ought to heard me, he said, the next day getting him told. He said, I called him everything in the book, and some of the things wasn't in the book. And then he went to trying to talk back to him, and I told him, shut up, don't talk back to me. And they said, well, what did you do? He said, when I got through talking, I just hung the phone up and walked off. I pastored a church in the eastern part of Oklahoma. Yeah, a few years, and this was a church where they couldn't keep nobody, couldn't keep a preacher. So I'd been down there 3 years, and so they asked one of the deacons, said, now, you all can't keep a preacher down here, and you got old Watts, said, and he's been down here for 3 years. Said, how's he staying? Well, they said, you know, this church never did want much of a preacher, and said he was about as near no preacher as we could get, so we just kept him. So when I got ready to leave, I told him, I said, now, church, I said, the same Jesus that sent me here, and now he's taking me away. One of the deacons jumped up and started out on that old song, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. I was the state president of the NAACP in Oklahoma for 16 years, and I remember one year there I was running for re-election, and I had some cards made, and I was passing them out, and had some fellow was sitting on an old long bench, and I gave him one of the cards, and one fellow, he looked at me and he said, yes, sir. He said, mister, I'll sure vote for you. He said, because that old thing we got in there, he sure ain't no count. You know, if you'll notice this sign down here, this Food for Peace. And I'm going to talk just a minute here before I make this introduction on Mr. LaRouche about hunger, something I know something about, poverty, and slums. Now, I grew up on the farm, and back there in the 30s, you could take, we had about 125 acres of land we farmed. We had 2 teams of mules. You could take $150 back there then, and you could make a crop on it. Well, when my dad would go to the bank to borrow some money, the banker would ask him this. He said, Watts, he said, you still got them 2 teams of mules? Yeah. You still got them 2 wagons? How many head of cows you got, Watts? Well, I got 25. How many hogs you got? They put on everything that you had. And then when you couldn't pay off, they cleaned you up. I never will forget the day they came down and cleaned my dad up. And Mama was standing there with tears in her eyes. Papa, he had a long face. They were driving the cattle out of the lot, getting the hogs out of the pen. They got everything but the guineas, and they couldn't catch them. Them guineas would sail away on them. I remember I caught a freight train, and I went to went to California. I didn't have but $1.35 when I left. And when I got out there, well, I was broke, and I met a white fella, and I asked him for money enough to get something to eat. And he said, son, he said, I'm just about in your shape. And he said, I ain't got no money. He said, but down on 16th Street, he said, they got a soup line. And he said, you can go down there and get in that soup line. You can get some soup. And I went down there about 9 o'clock and got in that soup line. I stayed there till 15 minutes to 5. 3 people before they got to me to run out of soup. Well, I sat down. I wrote my dad a letter. I told him the shape I was in. The gravel on the railroad done cut the bottom out of my shoes, and I had some pasteboard, and I'd cut out my soles, and I carried my soles in my pocket, and when one would wear out, I'd take it and put it in my shoes. And I told my dad about the shape I was in, and didn't have no money, was broke, and I signed off. I said, no mon, no fun, your son. So in about a week, I got a letter back from Dad. The old milk cow had died. One of the old mules was crippled, and he was in the worst shape then than he was when I left. And he signed off, too bad, too sad, your dad. He said, but son, if you can make it home, he said, we'll kill the fattening hog. Well, I caught a freight train, and in a few days, while I was back home, we went out there to kill the fattening hog, and he was so narrow between the eyes we couldn't shoot him. We had to smother him to death. You know, I don't know no place I had rather been this morning than here to introduce Mr. LaRouche. I believe if the Lord had called me up and said, Watts, he said, I'll pass the creation before you, I'd have probably turned him down. If President Reagan had called me, I know I'd have turned him down. I listened to Mr. LaRouche last night. One of the best talks that I ever heard. He hit home every lick. And then I was thinking about the program that our president has got going. They call Reaganomics. It's like a kite that won't fly, an alligator with no tail, a rooster with no spurs. It just don't work. We had a program we called the WIC program. Some of you all might be familiar with that. Women and infant children. And now I keep hearing them talk about abortion, and they're against abortion, but they cut out the WIC program that was saving hundreds of thousands of babies a year. When they cut out that particular program, we are losing now, it is estimated, over 100,000 babies a year. Now, my point is, what is the worst, to kill the baby before it's born or kill the baby after it's born? Now, all of us in here is going to heaven. Now, that sounds good, don't it? But now, here is what Jesus is going to say to some of us. When I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me no water to drink. When I was on my bed of affliction, you didn't administer unto me. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. Depart from me, ye workers of iniquity, I made you, but I know you not. Now, you see, they done got to heaven just having a little gate trouble. They there all right. Yeah. We had a fella that he overfilled his barns. He said, I'll have to tear them down and build them bigger, for I have no place to bestow my food. Now, if you'll notice in that part of the Bible, he speaks of I, me, and my 12 times. He forgets about everybody else. It's all for him and himself. I remember on this same trip that I was talking about, I never will forget this, Mr. LaRouche, and I had got put off a freight train, and I was walking, and I hadn't had nothing to eat in 2 days, and I saw a cowboy coming out across the prairie, and I walked down there, and he was on a horse, and I told him I was hungry and I wanted something to eat, and he turned around and went back, and he fixed a great big platter of sausage and eggs and hash browns and about everything you could think of. And then he had a glass of wine, big glass of wine on the side of it. And I ate that, and he asked me, he said, do you want a refill on that plate? And I said, no. I said, I've got plenty. I said, but I'd like to have a refill on that wine. I left him there just full as a tick and feeling pretty good. You know, we have some people we call the street people that I'm well acquainted with. People that sleeps on the bridges. People that sleeps out in the opening. I've been there. I know what it's all about. Then is something else that the average person is not acquainted with. And that is a group over here. Now, over in Germany, they call them the Gestapo. In Russia, they call them the KGB. Over here, they call them the FBI. And when you don't know them rascals, you don't know their operations. And they have an unlimited expense account. And they can spend all of the money they want to, jug you around just about any kind of way they want to. We had a case in Oklahoma, and this is where the principal of the school had the children working on the CETA program and making them give him half of their money. And you know who knew about it? The FBI, the Justice Department, our state senators, President Reagan, the whole bunch of them, and didn't do nothing about it. As of this day, those kids have never got their money back. This is some of the operation of the SBI and our Justice Department. Jesus, if you'll notice, and I'm closing this, and I want to close with the spirit of Mr. Lyndon LaRouches. Jesus, they couldn't break his spirit. Out of everything that they done to him, out of everything mean, cruel, and evil. And then he asked them, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. With the type of spirit that Mr. LaRouches, and I read about you, Mr. LaRouches, I keep up with it. With that type of spirit that won't be broke, we'll win in the long run. It is my honest belief that justice will be done in the long run. And all the crookedness will be exposed. And Mr. LaRouches kind of reminds me of the old ship of state that I read so much about, is sitting in the deep but quiet waters of the harbor. She had braved gales many, storms rough, waves high and mighty, but she didn't go down. There were times you could see her when she was rolling with the waves. You could hear her groaning in the gale, but didn't go down. If you keep that spirit, you'll win. That's the same spirit that John Brown said the gallows couldn't hang. It's the same spirit that Socrates said that hunger couldn't starve it, that hemlock couldn't poison it. It's the same spirit that Mahatma K. Gandhi said hunger couldn't starve it. The same spirit that Stephen said the stones couldn't strike it. The same spirit that Daniel said the lions couldn't chew it. The same spirit that the Hebrew boy said the fire couldn't burn it. The same spirit that Jesus said the cross couldn't crucify it. Mr. Lyndon LaRouches.
Well, you see what you're getting first before you applaud. Around this world, as most of you know, the condition exists and will worsen over the coming 12 months, which amounts to hearing a particular section of the Lord's Prayer coming from the developing nations, from the poor of Eastern Europe, from the poor, the tens of millions of poor in our own country. Give us this day our daily bread. The question is, who is going to answer that prayer? Who is going to be the hand of providence to ensure that entire nations are not biologically swept from the map in the coming years as Uganda is being swept from the map today? That the greatest genocide in all human history is not unleashed in full force in the coming 2 years. It's possible to locate fairly readily the principal immediate culprits for this drought. The drought is not natural. It's in the middle of a drought cycle. We should be at the high point of our weather patterns. We're in a drought. Man-made. Which men made it? Well, in the western part of the world, put the Soviet Empire and communist China to one side. In the rest of the world, the drought was made by the kinds of policies which have been maintained by the U.S. Department of Agriculture since the early 1960s. The Agricultural Department and its policies, as carried out by the European Commission and similar agencies around the world, if permitted, will kill more human beings with genocide than any other agency in history to date. Behind the Agriculture Department, which is not owned by the American people, it's owned by the international grain cartels. You had Clayton Uter up there in this conference, this GATT conference, which was blown up by the U.S. government because it wasn't getting its way. But you had Amstutz there. Amstutz is a member of Cargill. He's a Cargill official. Cargill grain cartel officials have run the Department of Agriculture of the United States, its policy, since at least the early 1960s under Kennedy and Johnson. And there's some gentlemen from Chicago who have a good deal to do with that, as some of you may know from Illinois. The forces behind the Agriculture Department in this country and in other countries, the grain cartel and the forces behind it, are the major cause of this. Another expression of this is the environmentalists. Much of this disaster has been caused by the influence of the environmentalists. The environmentalists are the greatest mass murderers in history, next to the grain cartel and the Agricultural Department's policies. It was called, we live in an earthly biosphere. Biospheres are organized in a certain way. I happen to know a good deal about it. Spent a great amount of my life on this particular question. The biosphere depends upon higher states of organization, and it depends upon an increase in the amount of energy organized in a suitable form available per square hectare and per unit weight of biomass. When you turn the clock backward by simply depleting rainforests, as they did in Brazil, as a result of U.S. and international financial institutions' policies beginning the 1960s, the Brazilian rainforests, and then later with the help of the liberals in this country and the Volkswagen Corporation, for example, extended to the Mato Grosso today, the rainforests of Brazil were looted. The land was turned into a desert in the areas that this was done. The area is spreading. The amount of land area lost in Brazil every year is equivalent to the size of a state of the United States annually. As a result of this in particular, one of the great weather systems of the world, the Brazilian Amazon system, decided to move from its usual parking place over the Amazon basin. It moved out into the South Atlantic. And this happened in the early 70s. It was a ping-pong effect on the entire world's weather systems. As a result, we've had problems ever since then. Similar policies were done in other parts of the world. When we put land into reserve without maintaining a cover on agricultural land put in reserve, we are destroying the environment. We are changing weather patterns. When we insisted that the sub-Saharan states increase the rate of taxation on grazing farmers, they overgrazed the land and helped to spread the desert, sub-Saharan desert, destroying entire regions. We cut down, or Japan did that in Indonesia, an entire island's wood supply in a rainforest. This happened to be situated in a location which is one of the most powerful catalysts for the world weather system, especially the monsoon system of South Asia and Southeast Asia. That was done. India, the average temperature in Fahrenheit degrees in India has risen about 10 degrees in the post-war period. Why? The cutting of trees as fuel for wood, for cooking. Why? Because of those who were opposed to a high technology orientation for the development of India's agriculture. We've looked at India's agriculture. It could be developed. In this case, it's not just the international authorities. It's one of the most evil phenomena on the face of this earth. Not the most evil, but one of the most evil. The Indian bureaucracy. The Indian state bureaucracy ruled India under the Mughals. Actually, the British simply provided support for them. They ran India under the so-called British Raj. And they run India today. And they're evil. India has one of the largest development budgets of any nation in the world. Government development budgets. Vast amount of money, because there's a large population. But if this money were properly spent for improvement of water management, for reforestation, especially with fruit trees, like the mango tree, cover the area with mango trees. You provide that and you provide food. With improvement of a rail system, which is breaking down for lack of nuclear power. The only power available to South India economically, most of India, is nuclear power. What they now use is coal. They transport the coal from the mines to the places where they combust the coal for generating electricity. The entire Indian railway system is occupied by transporting coal. The system is collapsing as a result of the transport of coal. Without nuclear energy, which can be developed in India very easily, they have one of the great sources of thorium, radioactive thorium in the world. And the thorium cycle fission reactor is perfect for them. With that, water management, transportation development, the development of India could be solved, that problem. It would be very readily solved. But that bureaucracy fears that if India is developed, the untouchables, the so-called, politely called the scheduled castes, and the other poorer strata, or less ranking social strata in India, would rise to social equality with the South Indian Brahmins. They would rather keep their own country in perpetual poverty than allow their fellow Indians to achieve social equality with them. So much for the sentiments in certain parts of the world. But it's this spirit, same spirit. Now let's go to the Soviet bloc. And then next to the question of the common feature. Soviet bloc is a very complicated question. Essentially, communism is the return to barbarism. In the case of Russia, there were forces in Western and Eastern Europe who were unified on the prospect that Russia should not be civilized. Now, we in the West, and we're speaking of our tradition, were determined to carry the spirit and culture of Western European Christian civilization into the world, especially into Europe. And it was our policy to bring the Slavs out of barbarism and bestiality. You had the Roman missionaries, Cyril and Methodius. Cyril, who's the famous priest missionary who gave the Russians their alphabet. Christianized the South Slavs, brought them out of barbarism and degradation. The Poles were brought out of degradation. And there were efforts in all parts of Russia, particularly in Slavic Russia, to bring about the same result. One of the most famous of these attempts was done by Gottfried Leibniz, who developed a program for the development of Russia, which he and others presented to Peter the Great, together with the establishment of the Petrograd Academy, which was the center of science and culture in Russia during the 18th century. This program was successful. The level of industrial development of Russia under Leibniz's program in the first half of the 18th century, into the first two-thirds actually, was more advanced than that of England. Russia had a higher level, I'm not talking about the rural sector, but a higher level of industrial development in the 18th century, the first half to two-thirds of the 18th century, in Russia than was true in England as a result of this program. A bunch of scoundrels such as Potemkin and the Orlov brothers, an evil story of evil in itself, began to turn back the clock. And they reached into the bowels of Russia in a force called the Raskolniki. And they organized the Pugachev revolt, using a combination of legitimate issues and the Raskolniki issue as a way of organizing insurrection. That failed, though it nearly succeeded. Russia, under an Alexander I who became increasingly clinically insane, and his successor, Nicholas I, went into the bowels of barbarism. And as a reward for being insane and barbaric, were appointed the policemen of Europe at the Council of Vienna in 1815 and remained the barbarian hordes to police Europe through the year 1849. And then people decided to change the map, and we had the so-called Crimean War, out of which Alexander II tried to civilize the place again. As Peter had, for example, Peter the Great had abolished serfdom. In the middle of the 18th century, the Venetian party inside Russia had brought back serfdom, slavery. In the 1860s, Alexander II, who allied himself with the United States and Abraham Lincoln specifically, and saved the United States by so doing, because France and Britain, under Palmerston and Russell, were going to invade the United States to ensure its partition. And Alexander II said he'd make war throughout all Europe if anyone tried to do that, and that was the end. And the famous letters of Prince Albert to Lincoln, and that was the end of the show. So that was too much for these fellows. Since they controlled the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, they created radical organizations based largely on the Raskolniki and crazy students. They assassinated, the Okhrana assassinated Tsar Alexander II. And beginning in 1881, 1882, unleashed the Russian part of a host of secret police created and controlled organizations. The terrorists, the Narodnaya Volya, the killers, the People's Will killers, the populist Narodniks generally. Zionists, Russian Zionism was created by the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, and was finished off and established at the beginning of this century by the famous colonel of the Okhrana, the same Colonel Zubetov who ran the Bolshevik Party, which has a great deal to do with some U.S. security risks in high places in Israel today. What they did, as Lenin himself emphasized, in bringing Bolshevism to power with the help of powerful agencies in the West, including powerful forces within the House of Morgan inside the United States, and the family and circles of former President Theodore Roosevelt. They brought to power the Raskolniki. They brought to power barbarism against the efforts to civilize Russia, to develop Muscovite Russia around the doctrine of making Moscow the eternal world capital of a worldwide Roman Empire, and the Muscovites, as such, the ruling eternal master race of the entire planet. The program, which were known to most of us as the Nazi doctrine, was developed in Germany as an importation of these ideas. Nazism in Germany was a Russian cultural importation into the form of the German language. The very term Third Reich came directly from Dostoevsky. This doctrine of the Bolsheviks is the Dostoevsky doctrine. Specifically, it is Satanism. I'll come to that in a moment. What they've done is in order to establish control, is to attack those sections of Russian culture in the large, particularly the Ukrainians, which was capable of providing the food requirements of the society. The black earth of the Ukraine, one of the great riches of this planet for agricultural production. If you treat it with any respect at all, it'll feed you and feed many more beside. In 1959, Khrushchev came to Iowa, and he got advice from a dumb farmer in Iowa, Gart, who's still respected. The man's a fool. He went back and he applied Gart's program to Russia. And he said, well, this will enable me to eliminate the Ukrainians, to eliminate the Ukrainian farmer. So in 1959, Khrushchev, advised by this crazy Iowa leftist farmer Gart, tried to put in Gart's program. It was called the Western Lands Program, the Pioneer Lands Program. They went around, they scraped up Communist Party youth and similar cadre and said, you're going to go out to the Western lands and you're going to farm, and we're going to close down these last remnants of kulaks in the Ukraine in order to break the back of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian farmers, who were dekulakized, were shipped into the cities to work as industrial workers. The incompetents were left behind. The incompetent programs were left behind. And they sent these fools these Communist Party volunteers out to the western lands, or eastern lands, to colonize the so-called virgin lands, and in 3 years they had a disaster, for reasons any farmer would understand. Also, they were communist apparatchiks, which meant they were very lazy. They wouldn't work 14, 16 hours a day to keep the farm going when the animals of the crop needed it. So in that sense, not just because it's communism, not because the usual things that Reagan and others might have said in the past about Russia, but because the system, which is the essence of Bolshevism, attacks that aspect of culture and the individual, which makes the individual at the best in our society in the past. An individual who's constantly progressing on the average in productive powers, in the ability to produce food, for example. And that's the reason the Russians can't produce their own food. We have a similar case in mainland China, which is falling apart. People talk about the China card. I wouldn't want to hold that card. I wouldn't want to hold credit on it. May not last too long. The argument came up very clearly to me. I knew this well. I talked to some of the trade representatives of Communist China a few times. And I talked to our friends in Japan about the problem a few times, back some years ago. And I followed very closely the bitter, acrimonious arguments which the Beijing representatives made against the arguments of Japan. The Japanese said to Beijing, we're willing to help you. We're crazy. We're willing to invest in all kinds of things to help China develop. But the only problem is what you're proposing that we do won't work. It will be a failure because you have no infrastructure. You don't have railroads. You don't have other kinds of basic infrastructure, water development, similar kinds of things. You're not doing it. And we had some discussions with some Chinese foreign trade representatives from Beijing on the same issue in a different context. And the answer is very clear. And it became most clear to me when I looked in the situation in Taiwan. China is a culture which has a few hundred families, named families. The families, apart from the fact that there's certain historical differentiation in the arrival of Chinese on the island of Taiwan, it's the same people, the same families. Mainland China is a disaster. Taiwan is a success. Again, people of the same culture, China culture. Taiwan is a success despite the State Department. Mainland China, despite the State Department, is a great failure. A slave state. What's the difference? In Taiwan, the development of the Taiwan economy from 1949 on was based on a program of the Kuomintang which emphasized state responsibility for development of basic economic infrastructure in terms of very specific infrastructural goals to be reached. And they have a map in the museum there of the goals, the year they were adopted, the initial goals, the year they were completed, pictures of various stages of the process, and you can see it in the island. The island works, except to the extent it's corrupted by the State Department and similar kinds of American liberal influence. Why couldn't the people in the mainland, who come from the same family culture, achieve the same result? With the same policy, they could. Now look at the answer from Beijing. We will walk on two legs. One leg, Western leg, Western technology. The other leg, the China leg, old China policy. No development, essentially. No infrastructural development. We will keep the rural population percentile the same. which means backwardness. So therefore, it goes through a process which threatens to tear the culture of mainland China apart. First of all, birth control, the most hideous imaginable birth control. Why? China has enough land to develop, to expand, to deal with its population. It requires water management, other developments in the mainland. It can be solved. But no, if you're unwilling to take those steps, then China appears to be overpopulated because you're not developing your land and your technology to sustain the increased population. Therefore, rather than change a bad policy, kill people. So, birth control. The next step is kill old people. Various ways of doing that, which is what's happening in the United States with our health care programs. It's been going on in our health insurance programs. It's been going on for some years, but that's another subject. So we find that in both cases, in communist Russia and communist China, you find what is in fact a denial of the people of those countries of the right to express the natural cultural development which would allow them to solve these kinds of problems. And this manifests itself most readily, for various reasons, but I don't need to go into, in terms of the agricultural crisis. Along comes this food crisis, global food crisis, which will dominate us for the next 2 years. And these societies are plunged into a disaster. Mainland China today is an economic disaster. It's a hellhole. Oh, you may not see it, but in depth it is. So as a result of these kinds of policies, one side you have the Soviet policy, Beijing policy on cultural policy. You have the Malthusian post-industrial policy together with the cartel policy of looting in the Western world. The whole planet is being subjected to genocide. The destruction, rather than where we used to build up nature, as we build up the United States, to enable us to sustain more people at a higher standard of living. Today, the policy is, around the world at the highest level, there are too many people. We don't like so many people. One is tempted to say, well, if you think the world is overpopulated, why don't you go someplace else? I don't happen to think so. I think the world is underpopulated. There's not enough good people. Maybe we could have more people, we'd have more good people. Right? So that is what we're doing to nature. We're not. This would mean what? Increasing the density of energy. Where we should have a policy, very explicitly. Where we write gigawatts of energy today, we have to say in 2 generations from now, we write terawatts of energy. Very simple. We can do it if we are determined to do it. We can increase the potential population density of this planet in the next 50 to 60 years by a factor of 10. If we used all the technology we had at the beginning of the 1970s and applied it freely on a global scale to all people, including infrastructural technology, this planet could sustain between 15 and 25 billion people at a standard comparable to that we used to enjoy in the United States when times were much better about 20 years ago. And we all had a better living standard. Right? With what we have available, we can increase that standard of living by a factor of 40 to 50 times in terms of productivity over the next 2 to 3 generations. We have the means in hand to do so if we're so determined. That is, if we were to take the attitude which the United States had under the Kennedy space program, or it was actually the Eisenhower Kennedy space program, from about 1958, the so-called Sputnik, post-Sputnik program, to about 1965. If we maintain that, combined with policies of investment tax credits for investments of a suitable kind, with a science enrichment program in our schools and similar kinds of things that we did then, nothing more than that, I can assure you that knowing what we know is important to work upon in science, in technology, knowing the kinds of projects which are the best way to express these technological improvements, I assure you that if mankind on this planet had the political will to do that, we would increase the potential population density of this planet at a higher standard of living by factors as much as 40 over the decades. Next 3 generations, a factor of 10. We could sustain, by the end of this century, or the end of the 2 generations, we could say we would be sustaining a potential population in the order of magnitude of 100 billion people. More comfortably, much better fed, much more secure, much freer, much less crowded than today, because we'd use land more intelligently. So there is no objective reason why we have to put up with this nonsense. But let me just go briefly to one thing, and then I come to the second, and then the third points I want to make today. I could make many points, but I'm limiting myself, indulging myself by limiting myself to 3. This enemy we face, and I'll come back to this at the end, why I bring this in at this time. This enemy we face, all of us, in every nation, is a satanic movement. Literally, explicitly. It is necessary to refer to this as satanic because it is, and secondly, because if you try to avoid that issue, you will not find the ability to understand it or to fight it successfully. Formally, Satanism in this form was developed during the second half of the 19th century. It was associated with people in Britain, with John Ruskin of Oxford University and his circle, and the pre-Raphaelites, as they were called. With the outgrowth of that, such as British socialism, which was created by Ruskin's Satanist circles. Out of that, the Theosophy movement of Blavatsky, of that sort of thing. And Theosophy revealed itself very quickly to be Satan worship. On the continent of Europe, we had people like Jacob Burckhardt, who was a confederate of Marx and of Richard Wagner in his youth, and who became a close admirer of Nietzsche in his elder years. Also of the same spirit as John Ruskin. Now these people proposed, well, they naturally being witches, they reverted to astrology. And they said, well, we have been living under the reign of Socrates and Christ, which they said astrologically is the age of Pisces, the age of the fish. They said this must end. We now call for the triumph of Satan. This was Nietzsche. This is Dostoevsky explicitly in his Inquisitor. This is Aleister Crowley, the man behind Bertrand Russell, for example, behind the Huxley brothers. This is the age of Aquarius. Nietzsche said he heralded the Antichrist, who he said is Dionysius. Aleister Crowley agreed. But, he said, I personally prefer Lucifer. And he organized the Lucifer cult, which is called Theosophy, the worship of Lucifer. All of these varieties of Satanist movements are known today, in the broader term, as they were known then, as the Age of Aquarius movement. The movement based on the concept of the dawning of the Age of Aquarius, the Age of Satan, and is known in short as New Age. Now, you may have paid some attention to an event which occurred earlier this unhappy week. The man wearing the mark of the beast showed up at the UN. And Gorbachev means the hunchback of Moscow. Gorbachev. He gave a speech at the UN. Now, he didn't really make any offer. He announced that in 1990, or approximately, the Soviets are going to withdraw their obsolete tanks that they'd planned to withdraw anyway from Central Europe. Didn't say what they were going to replace them with. But the essential thing he announced, he said, we are now in the process of establishing a New Age world, one world, an interconnected world based on the New Age philosophy, Malthusianism, more environmentalism, shutting down of industries, suppression of technology. And that is really what we face. The evils we face, the enemy we face, comes like an assassin from many ancestries and from many quarters and in many guises. When the assassin attacks your family, you must defend your family against the assassin. But the hired assassin is never your ultimate enemy. If you could neutralize the assassin, you would prefer not to kill him, because he's a human being. It's what's behind him that you must eliminate. And what's behind this assassin, what is commonly behind, those liberals who are associated with the cause of theosophy, who are associated with Bertrand Russell, with H.G. Wells, with the Huxleys, with liberation for witchcraft, the legitimization of witchcraft, the worship of Satan as a religion, a big issue in parts of the United States. With that kind of garbage, what created Bolshevism in Russia, what created and orchestrated the horror show in China, after many other horror shows which had nearly destroyed the country many times before then. There's one common enemy. Mussolini was part of the same thing. So was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was a Gnostic, a member of this quasi-Satanic cult, the Gnosticism. The Gnostics generally today are found in South America, where they run the terrorist organizations, or many of them. They're Soviet assets. The Gnostic Christian Church of Venezuela and Colombia is the core of terrorism in those two, the best organized terrorism. And there's unfairly good relations with the U.S. State Department. So we have an enemy which is of this nature, a satanic movement. And I'll come back to this. Therefore, what do we face in the years ahead? Immediately ahead. There are two kinds of natural law, or two aspects of natural law. One are the laws of the universe, and a man who, or say a Congress were to repeal the law of gravity, just for illustration, would that repeal the law of gravity? It would not. So that whenever men, because they have great political power, say that they are defying what is in effect a law of the physical universe, a law of nature, natural law, and they cause others by their power to support that defiance of nature, what happens to the nations which defy nature? They are crushed, they're destroyed. Their defiance of natural law becomes the instrument of their destruction. If you support politicians who engage in that defiance of natural law, what do you bring upon yourself and your nation? You become an accomplice, you enforce that destruction, you bring about the destruction of your nation, your family, of everything. If the policies which Ronald Reagan appeared to greet as the official representative of Nancy Reagan so warmly at New York's UNO last week, if those policies of the Gorbachev glasnost lovers, the appeasers, and the Soviets are allowed to go forward, this planet has already shown, in the form of the eruption of this food crisis, a symptom that this biosphere is about to reject us. Not finally, but it's had enough of our nonsense. And we are about to inflict upon ourselves a great punishment. Not only will those be punished who set themselves up as the gods of Olympus to defy natural law, but those of us who consent not to prevent them from doing this will be destroyed too. And there lies upon us then, in how we respond to that challenge, the moral responsibility for the fate of hundreds of billions of souls who, in all propriety, should be born in the time to come. There lies upon us the responsibility of looking back to those martyrs who gave us institutions in which truth was given social standing, and thus freedom. There is no freedom without truth, and there is no truth without freedom. The right of an individual, informed by right principles, to come to an opinion based on reason, not arbitrary opinion, but based on careful employment of reason. And the right of that individual to stand up and say, this is what I believe, unless I am persuaded to the contrary by reason. That is freedom. If the entirety of society disagrees with you, so what? You have the right, as long as you're guided by reason, and as long as you will submit yourself to correction of your opinion by reason, that is the right to assert an opinion contrary to the majority of society around you. That is freedom. A democratic society, as Project Democracy and the Congress defines it today, is the most horrible abomination imaginable, against which the founders of the United States warned. Democracy is the worst of all evils, the worst of all tyrants, because there is no worse tyrant than in the irrational mob, the lynch mob. Democracy, as they define it, is lynch mob democracy. Just don't have the wrong color of skin or the wrong color of opinion, under which the individual has no right but the right to agree with what appears to be majority or ruling opinion. And if the mob changes its opinion, you tear off your clothes and put on the clothes it puts on, and so forth and so on. A society of fads and insanity with no moral purpose, no character, and no ability to reason. the defense of the individual who wishes to reason, who wishes to be governed by natural law and reason. That is the most sacred duty of society, the defense and nurture of such individuals. And a society which does not fulfill that mission is unfit to exist. A form of government which does not serve that purpose is not fit to exist, because it does not protect the most precious part of human society, the development of the powers of reason in the individual. The thing that makes us truly human. The thing that makes our lives, individual lives, each sacred. And that's what is at stake. We have each an individual responsibility if we wish to be free. Martyrs who understood the principle which I've just stated, many of them fought over generations, often seemingly without hope of victory, to bring into being those conditions which the founders of our republic, in the Declaration of Independence and as expressed in the Federal Constitution, especially the preamble, to bring about the condition of society which corresponded to the principles of truth and freedom. How many gave their lives for that purpose? How many gave us every gift of knowledge on which we depend, which we stand? And we look back, and if we betrayed the past, we betrayed that trust that they gave to us. And if we also look to the future and say to the hundreds of millions of souls waiting to be, billions of souls waiting to be born, we betrayed you too. What are we? We are as nothing. As I said last night, in a little discussion we had among some of us, the basic problem we face today in Western civilization is we don't have the guts to fight. And the reason we appease is because we're a bunch of cowards. Now, in the United States, for example, we have two levels of cowardice. The one is more readily noted, especially since the experience of the Vietnam War. In former times, it was customary in nations, at least in civilized nations, that a person would lay down their life in war for the sake of their country, for the sake of patriotism. At the end of the 1960s, patriotism became unfashionable. And senior officers, military officers of the United States, gave up studying military science in order to study the more advanced and more important science of career management. War became a business of shooting into the air and waiting for the negotiating team from the State Department. We've lost that kind of courage. Well, not everybody, but we don't need to, we in the United States don't need to discuss it much more. We know what that condition is among people around us. But there's another kind of courage. And the military people say, well, we've got to get people back willing to fight for their country. I say, why should they fight for their country? You mean you're against? No, I'm not against fighting for the country. But I'm giving you a Socratic question. Prove to us that patriotism is a valid emotion. Maybe when you're fighting for your country, you really should be fighting for something much more profound than your country. Maybe you should be fighting for the idea of your country as an instrument to serve the purposes of natural law in providing truth and freedom for the individual. Maybe that's what it's worth fighting for. Now, do you believe enough in truth and freedom so that you would fight under the following circumstances? Imagine yourself fighting in what has been called in China since the 1930s, when the Kuomintang first devised the concept, People's War. In People's War, there are no front lines. There are no rear echelons. Everywhere is a front line, and there are no rear echelons. It's every man, every woman, every person, and every aspect of life, cultural and so forth, in conflict with the adversary forces. 1% potentially lethal action, 99% cultural warfare of various forms. The kind of warfare we're fighting against the Soviets every day in every part of the world. 1% lethal, 99% cultural. We're in war with the Soviet Union. The idiots in Washington don't even know it. They don't even know what kind of a war it is. In that war, being a soldier is not enough. A patriot's courage is not enough. You have to look to something deeper in yourself. You have to look to the kind of courage which defines martyrs, which is not some grand and exceptional thing. It's a very important thing, but it's not a grand and exceptional thing, which happens to only a few. There are many martyrs in history, above and beyond those who were celebrated ones in name. When you're faced with that kind of situation, of dying perhaps an anonymous death in a remote village, with no one to put a marker on your grave, no uniform in which to be buried, you look within yourself and say, do you have the courage to do that? Most Americans today would say, they look in themselves, they say, no. I wish to survive. I will compromise with anything for survival. Some will even say they would compromise for the purpose of enjoying a next moment's additional pleasure, whatever they call it, imagine that pleasure to be. That in order to deal with the kind of crisis which confronts us, we must look within ourselves and find a value within us so precious that if we spent our lives to defend that value, we would have thereby gained our lives, because we had gained the purpose of our mortal existence. And that's what a soldier ought to carry into battle as courage. Not patriotism, but that. Not patriotism as the abstraction of a flag. Not patriotism as a racist concept. Not patriotism as in any other of these symbolic senses. But patriotism in the sense which we ought to have in the United States, but we're pretty much estranged from. To know what Ben Franklin and the others represented. It's a system of representative self-government under natural law and under law governed by natural law. That to imagine the horror of having once known such a form of self-government, to imagine living under slavery, which is not only a material oppression, but a destruction of the very soul of one's children, as we are slaves today in the United States. What do they do to us? We sit back, we old ones. We remember when we had old values. Look at our children, our grandchildren. What have they done to our grandchildren? It's like the invasion of the body snatchers. You send a child off to college, 2 legs, neatly dressed, and you wonder what species it is that came back to visit on Christmas. They're destroying our children. They're destroying our children's minds and souls. They're destroying our future. They're destroying the meaning of the existence of millions of generations before us. They're destroying the hope of hundreds of billions of souls begging to be born in the future. What better cause for war can there be than that? Not for the pleasure of war, but because there is placed before us an issue such that should we allow that issue to be lost, our entire lives were worthless. The lives of all of those who came before us were almost worthless. And those who come after us will either never exist or will exist as beasts. Not men, not human beings. What better cause for war is that? And if you can find within yourself the value to say that if I were to spend my life to win this war, I can face death, if that were the case, with joy, knowing that I've spent my life in order to gain it. And thus the most powerful idea in all Christianity is perhaps not that great mystery, the resurrection, but the image of Gethsemane. That each of us faced with such a situation must look at the image of Christ in Gethsemane and see coming to us a cup bearing the same bitter substance which faced Christ. As Christ was faced with his duty, so each of us, according to our talent and our circumstances, are faced with ours. I'll come back to this. But that's the idea which went on. Now, what is our immediate circumstance? Practical circumstance. It is said that George Bush was elected President of the United States. And I suppose in a negative way, though I never supported Mr. Bush, he owes me a great deal, because I certainly helped to put that imitation Dracula back in his box, Dukakis. I revealed the truth about Mr. Dukakis early on in the campaign, and people looked at him and said, you know, he is crazy. I don't hate the United, like electing Dukakis, the President of the United States, would be like the passengers of a transatlantic airliner voting to throw the flight crew overboard. We'll come to that theme again. So we have George Bush. Now, George Bush is a terrible politician, and I've always said so, and if you ever asked him for a policy statement, you know so. But George has a certain talent. He's what is called often these days, particularly since the mid-1970s in Europe, Western Europe, he's what's called a technician. He's a second generation, he's sort of a diaper baby of the oh-so-social formation called OSS. His father was as a senator, was one of the sponsors of the oh-so-social group, OSS. And so he's sort of a CIA diaper baby. And he hasn't changed since. Now, George has had a lot of experience as an administrator. Of course, he's been appointed to this and appointed to that and appointed to this. Well, that's what a bureaucrat is, a person who's appointed. A human being by appointment. But George has picked up a certain amount of skill. Now, in addition to the skill, he's a member of a group, a strata, a diversified strata, which are called, might be called the U.S. intelligence establishment. And about 2 generations of old boys participate in determining what George Bush is, what he controls. So that when you get George Bush, what you're getting is a bureaucratic team which is already moving toward the White House and will move into it, presumably, on Inauguration Day. The expert aspect of this team and of George himself is that he's an administrator. He's a political technician. He will move, as he already has, to bring what he calls the administration as such, and what he calls the agenda of the administration under control, as a good bureaucrat or administrator does. And therefore, in one sense, from the administrative standpoint, George Bush will be the most effective president of the United States since Eisenhower. As a president, he's an administrator. And in that sense, relative to the Reagan administration, he'll be much stronger than Reagan if he lasts that long. However, I point out to you that the worthy, experienced captain of that great Cunard unsinkable liner, the HMS Titanic, was one of the best administrators in the Cunard system. And he managed and administrated his ship from the top all the way down. Now, the point here is a problem you deal with all bureaucrats, and I've had to deal with them in dealing with spooks around government and so forth and whatnot over the years, and in other capacities, in corporate management consulting earlier. The trouble with these terrible bureaucrats, and with the families for whom they are power, with which they associate themselves, they get the idea in their head in the following lines. They think a bunch of wealthy families, financier families, generally centered upon the Lombards of Venice, the reinsurance cartels of those precincts, which pretty much run most of the world today, actually. I think these are the gods of Olympus. There is no God. There is only the gods of Olympus. The families. Now, the members of the family are not eternal, but they presume that the collection of families are each more or less eternal, in the same sense that the Greek myth would treat the gods of Olympus as in the main part eternal, although there might be a little substitution here and there. One god may drop out and another one come in as a new one. And these bureaucrats imagine that they are the court advisors who run the castles and administer the little princely domains of the families with which they're associated. And they say, well, look, we have great respect, of course, and we're very loyal to our prince, but he's really a damn idiot who we have to manage, and we have a real power. And then you get these concerts of bureaucrats from the various princely families, of noble families like the Morgans and whatnot, and they get together and they cut a deal. And that deal becomes known as policy. And they cut out arrangements by which this will be administered, and that's called methods and procedures. And they set up other constrictions upon the way things are functioned, which are called channels. And so the bureaucracy imagines in this sense that by these kinds of negotiations, renegotiations, and so forth, of deals, which become known as policies, methods, procedures, and channels, that they run the world. And they say, well, since we have the political power to control the will of those populations we brainwash with aid of the liberal news media, what force is there which could dare to defy our political will? They're like the man coming down, you know, Captain something or other, maybe Captain Bush, for example. He's coming down the Great Lakes in a big Indian canoe. He made the Great Lakes all the way from up there in northern Minnesota, made it all the way down through Lake Erie, and he's going toward Lake Ontario. They've gone through many small crises, but the captain standing in this canoe has kept the crew in line, and they have gotten through every crisis so far. And as he approaches Niagara Falls, he says, "Men, paddle. Control will see us through." And that's what's frightening about the Bush administration. Sometimes it were better that it were a little less efficient. Because mistakes are not good, but when the policy is bad, a mistake is generally an improvement. You never want the bad guys to be too good, or the bad policies to be too effectively implemented. That's the danger. It's obvious there's several problems that Bush has. There are question marks on his dealing with the Soviets. There are question marks on his dealing with our allies. These are question marks. These are very important questions, but I think in dealing with Bush, in the context we're addressing matters today, that is not the most crucial one. It's not the axiomatic issue. The thing that will sink the Bush administration or enable it to consolidate itself is an issue which must be determined within the first 30-odd or more days of the next administration. The issue is the international monetary and economic problems. If Mr. Bush, as president, were to choose to continue the policies associated with James Baker III as Treasury Secretary and so on, and before in the White House, then I would assure you that Mr. Bush would have, within 1989, a titanic success. It would be the end of the United States, virtually. It would be the end of Western civilization. And no matter what policies of virtue he might tend to favor on other issues, if he flunked on the issue of financial and economic policy, everything else would fall apart. Give him just one example of that. We worked for some time on the SDI. I was in and out of the National Security Council and elsewhere working on this, particularly 1982 into early 83. Now, we didn't have much of a problem at that point until October of 1982, when we succeeded in getting Dr. Teller, Edward Teller, to come out publicly and lead support for the program I had proposed. When Teller gave public endorsement to the SDI, what became known as the SDI program, as I proposed it, the fight began to start. Then, toward the end of the year, the Soviet government met with the leadership of the Democratic Party, not the leadership as such, but the ownership. People like the Harrimans, that sort of thing. And the leadership of the Democratic Party assured the Soviets that they would prevent my proposal from getting on the desk of President Reagan to be decided upon. So they were stupid. The Soviets always make mistakes. They made a big one with me. This is another story. Recently, it shows they haven't learned anything yet. So we weren't working through the channels they thought they were controlling. So the policy was adopted generally. An associate of mine sat down with a CIA official, science official, detailed to the Pentagon in early March of 1983, and they wrote down our policy in a set of words. Another friend of ours, who happened to be the president's speechwriter, or one of his speechwriters at that time, who was writing the speech for March 23rd, took that draft, which Pollock had, put that in as the third part of the speech, and that became the famous announcement of the SDI on March 23rd, 1983. Well, all sorts of things happened promptly thereafter. The Soviets tried every angle in the world, but the smart angle they came up with was what became known as Graham-Rudman. If you look at the great talk about the federal deficit of the United States, there's a lot of bunk. If you look at the listed GNP and compare the deficit of the United States as a percentage of the listed GNP of the United States, or the per capita federal deficit with the per capita GNP as listed of the United States, this is no problem. Oh, it's a nuisance. It is a problem in a sense, but this is not the issue. The fact the collapse of the tax revenue base is the issue, not the deficit as such. But what they did, beginning April of 1983. They said the only way we can stop this thing is by killing it on the budgetary level. So they moved beginning, Volcker went down to Washington in April of '83, after the Soviets and some liberals in Europe cooked this thing up. He went down there, began campaigning in the Congress for cuts in the military budget under the issue, the rubric of the argument, which later became known as Gramm-Rudman. And these liberals pushed through Gramm-Rudman and similar policies to gut the military policy of the United States. You look at the way the Congress and the administration face every issue of defense policy and strategy since April of 1983, and the way that everything is ruined is by somebody twisting the budgetary knife. The argument for pulling troops out of Western Europe, no one has ever come up with a very convincing argument that could be sold around Washington for pulling troops out of Europe per se, except budget, budget, budget. That doesn't mean the people who scream about budget are concerned about the budget. It simply means that they're on the Soviet line, whether they know it or not, of using the argument about budgetary means as a way of dealing with strategic issues and crippling the United States. And it's partly because of that that President Reagan, who was a Hollywood hero, sort of a Hollywood anti-communist or something, he liked to do that at parades and 4th of Julys. When he came up against the real communists, he withered. That is his wife I'm speaking of. But since the end of '83, when I was in the middle of it, I was one of the first to get the axe. The President of the United States, President Reagan, has made Neville Chamberlain look like a war hero. Step by step by step by step. Look at the reality. He says, but we haven't pulled all our weapons out of Europe. You say, but what happens if you pull out of Europe's will to defend itself? Right? There's a difference. An appeasement. So the problem is that if Bush capitulates on the economic issues and the financial issues, it continues the policy we associate with one of his so-called advisors, James Baker III, then we're all in it. The world is in it. Because then what will happen? Agricultural policy will be determined by these monetary policies, as well as military policy. Foreign policy will be dictated by these budgetary policies. And you know Bush, his administration will pull every trick in the world, including police-state intelligence methods, to ensure there is no resistance or impediment to these policies. I know the crowd he works with. I know what they're like. They'll do that. Once they decide something is policy, everyone is competing to prove they're the best person to carry out the policy and to prove maybe that their fellow next to them, their dear brother, is not so good as they are at doing that. And that's the way this throat-cutting, backstabbing business goes. So therefore, we must break that. Because unless we eliminate what Clayton Nutter and these other idiots and Cargill and the Amstrutzes, the Agriculture Department represents, what U.S. agriculture policy has been for the past 25 years, we must eliminate that root and branch. If we do that, if we say we're going back to the American system, we're going to use what Hamilton, List, and others proved worked. Again, we're going to use the principles which made the United States the most powerful nation in the world per capita. Go back to that. Principles which have been tested by other nations whose experience shows similar results. Then we can solve this problem. And we can handle the Soviet problem. Because from our confidence in the fact that we're getting out of the mess, and our confidence that we're becoming decent again, we will find the moral strength to deal with the Soviets. But it's not merely a matter of having the right policy. And that brings me to my concluding point. I don't know, I may offend some of our Protestant friends, but I think it has to be said. There is no faith without works. And the correspondence between faith and works is crucial. What you do is what you believe, with the discounting factor that if you express sincere regret for the time that your foot slips, that's counted as part of the works. A lot of backsliding sinners suddenly come through and become martyrs once in a while. So we don't write you out if you make a lot of mistakes. But the intent, what you're committed to. For example, how can a person say they have Christian faith if they support monetary policies which mean genocide against entire nations of the third world? That's not Christianity. Oh, that's not Christianity. They cannot say they have Christian faith. Economic justice, the concern for other families, the concern for the conditions under which the new members of other families are born and raised, what kind of human beings they have a chance of becoming, what chance they have to make a contribution to humanity as a whole. And since we're very frail and we're very mortal, we as individuals can't keep the world running. We keep the world running through sovereign nations. And these sovereign nations become like personalities. The individual contributes to the nation and its work and its purpose. The nation as a kind of personality of greater durability works with other nations, similarly sovereign, to bring about a condition on this planet corresponding to a common purpose. Now, in this matter, the way in which we organize around the food for peace question will determine whether or not we succeed. Let me be very brutally frank about this, as I am on many occasions. I've been involved in a significant degree in fighting the agricultural issue in this country and abroad for about 12 years. And I tell you that in general, except for a handful of farmers in this country, among farmers, they behave like a bunch of idiots. When you would tell farmers how they ought to organize, they say, no, we're going to just organize farmers, and we farmers, as farmers, will work out tactics for solving our problems. Now, where are those farmers today? Where are those farm organizations which had this great, all-so-wise policy? Then on the other hand, you go out to the other side of the tracks. You go out to the people who eat. And you say to the people that eat, well, look, if the farmers are not able to produce, what's going to happen to your diet? And they say, oh, I don't depend on farmers. I buy my food at the supermarket. And that is literally the case. I'm not exaggerating. That's not hyperbole. I've had this thrown in my face so many times by the so-called consumerists. See, the society is divided into two kinds of people, according to late President Johnson. Producers and consumerists. And we have to protect the consumerists against the producers. Matter of fact, we've succeeded. Only about less than 10% of the total population of the United States is in any way productive. Guess why we have inflation? Guess why we're poor? Someone said we had too much agriculture, too much industry, too much infrastructure. All the things which are productive. So we stopped doing productive things. We turned ourselves into an international scrap heap, a junkyard, a wasteland, an agro-industrial wasteland. And you can see it flying over this country on a clear day. agriculture as we used to see it flying over the same territory. Look at it today. Go to the areas. Look at what about Southworks in Chicago? Right? What happened to that? What happened to the other industries? Where's the tax revenue base of the cities? What are we doing with our suburban sprawl? We're not housing more people. We're moving people out of slums into places with 30-year mortgage and a 10-year life expectancy. When these gypsum shacks fall down, $250,000, $300,000 shacks made of junk won't last 10 years. If a heavy man leans against one of these row shacks, oh, kitten, come on, it's going to come down. Imagine if you had elephants with this thing. Gale force wind to take the whole thing out in the Atlantic. What we have to do is recognize that in order to win, we can't count people in numbers alone. You have to count the combat potential of people for what China calls people's war, in which there are often no front lines, except everything is a front line. You have to build the spiritual strength of people. Now, we're not forming a church. There are, in my opinion, too many of them already. Not too many varieties of them. But that's not my business. But we have to attend to the way our works impact upon the faith needed for the struggle. We have to fight in a manner which is consistent with that for which we fight. The farmers and the eaters must unite. They have but one cause, one common interest, no essential conflict between them. What is good for the farmer is good for the eater. Without that, their eaters will cease to be eaters, which is what this problem is. There is no part of society, no constituency, which does not have the same interest. There is the people of no nation has any different interest than that of any other nation in this matter. We're speaking of the future of hundreds of billions of unborn souls, without whose success our lives mean nothing. That is the common interest which unites each and every one of us, such that there is no distinction among any of us on this issue, on this cause, on this interest. If we fight so, if we fight with love of humanity, by thinking especially of those hundreds of billions of souls waiting to be born, and thinking also of those whose martyrdom and other sacrifice gave us what was our potential and our debt to them, respecting what we pass on to the future. And if we think of our lives not as something lived from moment to moment, but as a very small piece of experience, with a beginning and not too much later an end. And think of our lives not as things which are lived for pleasure in and of themselves, but as an opportunity to fulfill a purpose which is reflected in what we bequeath to those hundreds of billions of souls waiting to be born in their condition. Such that if we at any point were to cut short our mortal life by spending it in a way which ensured the cause of those hundreds of billions of souls yet to be born, we could walk to death with joy because we had completed our life, fulfilled it. We might have been denied a chance of fulfilling it a little bit more, but nonetheless, we had fulfilled it. The joy of life, the true joy of life, which relates to what the New Testament calls agape in the original Greek, caritas in the Latin, and charity in the King James Version, is referred to in 1 Corinthians 13. The quality of agape, the quality of charity, the quality of sacred life, of love, which unites us as individuals with the hundreds of millions of unborn souls for whose love we can give our lives, and who we can walk smiling with joy, knowing that in a sense they love us too, even though they're yet to be born. It gives us a sense of the true importance of our lives, the true joy of being a living human being. And we must work with one another in the sense of that attitude toward humanity, historical humanity, humanity which, as a great family, which owes to its past generations and the present owes to its future generations. The love uniting that family is, in the matter of works, the practical expression of faith, from which faith, the strength to fight and win this war, derives. If we can do so, I am certain we shall win. I'm better than most at understanding the laws of nature, natural law generally, and understanding such recondite concepts as absolute time and things of that sort. And I can understand perhaps more readily than most how faith expressed in this way, in a practical way, is assured of success. We are each little, we are each individual. But if we know we're united to this effect, then we know that what each of us as an individual does in this united way will be caused to prosper. Thus, in this terrible moment of humanity, when civilization as we've known it for hundreds of years threatens to be removed from us in the coming 2 to 10 years or so, we have the risk of losing civilization. And we also have the possibility of a heroic solution to this crisis, of becoming generations which in our time, faced with the cup of Gethsemane, accepted it and thus perpetuated in the imitation of Christ the cause of the salvation of future souls.
Big football tackles carried her out one night, and he'd weigh about 290, stand about 6'6". And this little fella, he said, yeah, he said, he carried my girl out, and he said, you ought to heard me, he said, the next day getting him told. He said, I called him everything in the book, and some of the things wasn't in the book. And then he went to trying to talk back to him, and I told him, shut up, don't talk back to me. And they said, well, what did you do? He said, when I got through talking, I just hung the phone up and walked off. I pastored a church in the eastern part of Oklahoma. Yeah, a few years, and this was a church where they couldn't keep nobody, couldn't keep a preacher. So I'd been down there 3 years, and so they asked one of the deacons, said, now, you all can't keep a preacher down here, and you got old Watt, said, and he's been down here for 3 years. Said, how's he staying? Well, they said, you know, this church never did want much of a preacher, and said he was about as near no preacher as we could get, so we just kept him. So when I got ready to leave, I told them, I said, now, church, I said, the same Jesus that sent me here, and now he's taking me away. One of the deacons jumped up and started out on that old song, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." I was the state president of the NACCP in Oklahoma for 16 years, and I remember one year there I was running for re-election, and I had some cards made, and I was passing them out, and had some fellows was sitting on an old long bench, and I gave them one of the cards, and one fellow, he looked at me and he said, "Yes, sir," he said, "Mister, I'll sure vote for you." He said, "'Cause that old thing we got in there, he sure ain't no count." You know, if you'll notice this sign down here, this Food for Peace. And I'm going to talk just a minute here before I make this introduction on Mr. LaRouche about hunger, something I know something about, poverty, and slums. Now, I grew up on the farm, and back there in the 30s, we had about 125 acres of land we farmed. We had 2 teams of mules. You could take $150 back there then, and you could make a crop on it. Well, when my dad would go to the bank to borrow some money, the banker would ask him this. He said, "What?" He said, "You still got them 2 teams of mules?" "Yeah." "You still got them 2 wagons?" "How many head of cows you got, Watts?" "Well, I got 25. "How many hogs you got?" They put on everything that you had. And then when you couldn't pay off, they cleaned you up. I never will forget the day they came down and cleaned my dad up. And Mama was standing there with tears in her eyes. Papa, he had a long face. They were driving the cattle out of the lot, getting the hogs out of the pen. They got everything but the game. They did over 100,000 babies a year. Now, my point is, what is the worst, to kill the baby before it's born or kill the baby after it's born? Now, all of us in here is going to heaven. Now, that sounds good, don't it? But now, here is what Jesus is going to say to some of us. When I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me no water to drink. When I was on my bed of affliction, you didn't administer unto me. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. Depart from me, ye workers of iniquity, I made you, but I know you not. Now, you see, they done got to heaven just having a little gate trouble. They there all right. Yeah. We had a fella that he overfilled his barns. He said, "I'll have to tear them down and build them bigger, for I have no place to bestow my food." Now, if you'll notice in that part of the Bible, he speaks of I, me, and my 12 times. He forgets about everybody else. It's all for him and himself. I remember on this same trip that I was talking about, I never will forget this, Mr. LaRouche, and I had got put off a freight train, and I was walking, and I hadn't had nothing to eat in 2 days, and I saw a cowboy coming out across the prairie, and I walked down there, and he was on a horse, and I told him I was hungry and I wanted something to eat, and he turned around and went back, and he fixed a great big platter of sausage and eggs and hash browns and about everything you could think of, and then he had a glass of wine, big glass of wine on the side of it. And I eat that, and he asked me, he said, "Do you want a refill on that plate?" And I said, "No." I said, "I've got plenty." I said, "But I'd like to have a refill on that wine." I left him there just full as a tick and feeling pretty good. You know, we have some people we call the street people that I'm well acquainted with. People that sleeps on the bridges. People that sleeps out in the opening. I've been there. I know what it's all about. Then it's something else that the average person is not acquainted with. and that is a group over here. Now, over in Germany, they call them the Gestapo. In Russia, they call them the KGB. Over here, they call them the FBI. And when you don't know them rascals, you don't know their operations. And they have an unlimited expense account.
And with a massive grain shortage occurring in the developing sector and a drought within the United States. In other words, this food situation had reached such a critical moment that under those conditions, the Soviets, who were attempting to gain military superiority, would, under certain conditions where they did not have food and no prospects of getting food, would be encouraged to launch a military expedition into Western Europe to take food. So under those conditions, the question of food production became a national security issue and no longer an issue of feeding people. That's obviously fundamental, but it became a national security issue. And it remains a national security issue. And the fact that the USDA has sent letters, or the FMHA, has sent letters to 50 to 80,000 farmers in the United States to tell them that they are going to be thrown off their land, and these are 60-page documents which we'll have somebody reporting on, which nobody can understand. It is a national security issue that we will not lose 50,000 farmers this year. It is a national security question. The issue of food is now a national security issue, because the issue is very directly, will the Soviets come in and steal the food, which they have a proclivity to do, or will we have both the military and industrial might to both make it unnecessary and impossible for the Soviets to do? And that's why we call it food for peace. It is not a utopian fantasy that Harry Truman had of a one-world, lovey-dovey food for peace thing. This is literally a fighting issue. And the reason that we are here today is that we are the people who are going to tell the world about this, and we're going to stop, and this is what I think the big worry is. We intend to stop what is about to occur. We intend to resist what they intend to do. And I think they know that about us. So I would like to now introduce Reverend Wade Watts, who is the executive director of the NAACP in Oklahoma, to introduce our next speaker.
To Mr. LaRouche and my Heavenly Father children, I'm happy to be here to make this introduction. I've got a nephew that quarterbacked the Oklahoma University football team back in the late 70s. And he was telling me about a little fella that weighed about 135 pounds, and he was going with a girl, and one of them Guinness, and they couldn't catch him, and them Guinness would sail away on them. I remember I caught a freight train, and I went to California. I didn't have but $1.35 when I left, and when I got out there, well, I was broke, and I met a white fella, and I asked him for money enough to get something to eat, and he said, "Son," he said, "I'm just about in your shape." And he said, "I ain't got no money." He said, "But down on 16th Street, he said, they got a soup line, and he said, you can go down there and get in that soup line, you can get some soup." And I went down there about 9 o'clock and got in that soup line. I stayed there till 15 minutes to 5, 3 people before they got to me to run out of soup. Well, I sat down. I wrote my dad a letter. I told him the shape I was in. The gravel on the railroad done cut the bottom out of my shoes, and I had some pasteboard, and I'd cut out my soles, and I carried my soles in my pocket, and when one would wear out, I'd take it and put it in my shoes. And I told my dad about the shape I was in, and didn't have no money, was broke, and I signed off. I said, "No mon, no fun, your son." So in about a week, I got a letter back from Dad, The old milk cow had died. One of the old mules was crippled, and he was in a worse shape then than he was when I left. And he signed off, "Too bad, too sad, your dad." He said, "But son, if you can make it home," he said, "we'll kill the fattening hog." Well, I caught a freight train, and in a few days, while I was back home, we went out there to kill the fattening hog, and he was so narrow between the eyes we couldn't shoot him. We had to smother him to death. You know, I don't know no place I had rather been this morning than here to introduce Mr. LaRouche. I believe if the Lord had called me up and said, "Watts," he said, "I'll pass the creation before you," I'd have probably turned him down. If President Reagan had called me, I know I'd have turned him down. I listened to Mr. LaRouche last night, one of the best talks that I ever heard. He hit home every lick. And then I was thinking about the program that our president has got going. They call Reaganomics. It's like a kite that won't fly, an alligator with no tail, a rooster with no spurs. It just don't work. We had a program we called the WIC program. Some of you all might be familiar with that. Women and infant children. And now I keep hearing them talk about abortion, and they're against abortion, but they cut out the WIC program that was saving hundreds of thousands of babies a year. When they cut out that particular program, we are losing now, it is estimated.
Second International Food for Peace Conference. My name is Gerry Rose. I'm on the International Executive Committee of the National Caucus of Labor Committees, that famous organization, philosophical organization, which is frightening our enemies. And I'm also one of the founders of the Food for Peace movement. We have today with us an extraordinary gathering representing 7 nations as far away as New Zealand and Australia, West Germany, Lesotho, several other nations which you will be hearing from today, which is actually the power of the International Food for Peace movement. As you will hear through the course of the panels, one of the critical tactics that the world grain cartels are attempting to impose is to get American farmers to dump their food at below parity prices and have a trade war, which Clayton Yoder, who was our so-called trade representative at the GATT negotiations, indicated. We'll go through that a little later. So the fact that this is an international movement has given our enemies some cause to think, and you will hear about this. I just want to go through a little history of the Food for Peace movement so that you know something about it, those of you who are here for the first time. In August of this year, at the National Democratic Party convention, a platform was written by the economist Lyndon LaRouches. In this platform, it indicated the kind of crisis that the world was facing. And it critically focused on the issue of food, because at the time we were going through the worst drought in history, particularly in America, and roughly 50% of all food that is exported comes from American granaries. With the drastic collapse of stocks of food, what Lynn indicated is that the actual result of this would be that the Soviets also were involved in a massive collapse of their own food production. And we had an indication in China, in other places around the world, a massive drought was going on. And in other places of the world, a massive flood was going on. With the drop and collapse of the food stocks, this would indicate a drastic shortage of food, a massive shortage of food. Now, under conditions where the Soviets were looting Eastern Europe at an unprecedented rate for their own military buildup, given simultaneously that their own food production, because of this looting, was being destroyed by such looting, the Soviets would have a massive grain shortage, coupled